My name is Jason.
My name is David.
And this is Discern Realities, a Dungeon World podcast. So, listeners, we are back with the Dungeon World Basics series. This week on Basics, we are going to be talking about GM moves. Next week, we're going to begin the process of talking about fronts, but today we are doing moves, and I thought we'd kick off, David, by just saying what the book's definition of GM moves are.
Yeah, so the book says whenever everyone looks to you to see what happens, choose one of these. Each move is something that occurs in the fiction of the game. They aren't code words or special terms. Use up their resources literally means to expend the resources of the characters, for example.
Yeah, and that's directly from the book. This idea of like moves being something that the GM does when people look at you, that's a great way of putting it. There are actually a couple of other instances too. For example, if the player characters give you a golden opportunity, which we'll talk about, or if a 6- gets rolled and the player move in question doesn't have a defined 6- outcome, then that would be another time that the GM would do a move. But just kind of keeping it big picture for now, like what are GM moves? I think it's really interesting because Dungeon World was written back in, I guess, 2012 or something like that. And here in 2018, David, we have the benefit of a number of years of thinking about Dungeon World, of thinking about Powered by the Apocalypse games to sort of rely on, right? And in sort of modern times, I guess, it's more helpful, or some people believe it's more helpful to think about GM moves, not really as, quote, moves, but more as reactions. In the game Monster Hearts 2, Avery Alder began referring to, she doesn't even call the GM moves. She calls them reactions. And I think reactions is a really terrific word because that's basically what it is. The players fire off a move, the players do something, the players look at you, and you react.
Yeah, I think that's pretty true. There are some GM moves here called moves that would not exactly be reactions. Things happening in the background, things happening off screen. But I take your meaning, most of the time, it is a reaction to the situation as it's unfolding.
Well, I think maybe an even better formulation is the one put forward by Josh Fox. Josh Fox is the author of a number of games, including Lovecraft-esque and some Powered by the Apocalypse things as well. And Josh wrote this really fantastic article a few years ago about how, in his estimation, GM moves, like when the GM makes a move, essentially all of the moves, and we're going to talk about all the various Dungeon World ones, but all the moves in every PBTA game essentially boil down to do something that would be of interest to someone at the table. That's a very, very reductive way of putting it, but actually it's almost a bit like, pithy in a way, but I actually kind of like it. What do you think of that?
I like that better. I think that is what you're supposed to be doing as a GM, is doing things, making things interesting for at least one person, if not all the people at the table.
Well, and I would probably add to that, do something of interest to someone at the table, given the scope and context of what's happening in the fiction, right?
Right.
And so I like that. And I'll tell you another reason why I kind of like these formulations here, particularly Josh's, is, so listeners, if you're a brand new Dungeon World GM, you're going to see this list of moves, right? And they all say different things. And then there's also more than just the standard list. There's also monster moves and location moves and all that kind of thing. Those are all GM moves as well. But really, in play, after you get a little bit of practice, it doesn't take very long. In fact, just a few sessions under your belt, you will almost never look at this list again, right? David, has that been your experience? You kind of just internalize it.
Yeah. It's always interesting to come back and reread the text and think about the moves that I don't do that often, and kind of rework maybe my repertoire of moves that I try and hit frequently, because I do think that some of them I forget about, but honestly, a lot of the moves have a lot of overlap, and what you do as a GM and which moves you frequent is kind of your GM style. So it's always good to revisit it every once in a while, but I don't have it open before me or have a cheat sheet before me like when I GM a game.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I mean to say here, that's a good point. You play this game enough, you run this game enough, and really you run any Powered by the Apocalypse game enough, and you sort of like really own this idea of, you're just trying to do something interesting that makes sense in the fiction. Maybe you've read all the moves and those have given you an idea of what sorts of things you should be doing, but ultimately you're just kind of reacting to the fiction, right? And you're kind of just doing what makes sense in the moment. And I think that's what I mean there. No matter what the moves say on the sheet, you can't go wrong by just being honest about the fiction and doing what makes sense, right? Obviously, you want to start to internalize a notion of like soft moves versus hard moves, and we'll talk about that. But at the end of the day, it really just comes down to like a fair outcome in the fiction based off what the player character was doing or based off the sort of totality of the circumstances, right?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Like, the situation can matter so much as to like what constitutes a golden opportunity and what constitutes a soft move given the context, and maybe even what a hard move means in the context.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so we'll dive into it a little bit deeper here. But before we go, I do want to just kind of add one other thing that the book recommends, and we've said it last episode too. Always, 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 after you do your move, ask the players, what do you do? That back and forth, that conversation is key to Dungeon World. So always remember that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we mentioned it a bit earlier. Let's talk about soft moves versus hard moves. David, what's your definition of the two?
So this is from the book. It doesn't lay it out as quite like I've laid it out here, but it says soft moves have no immediate irrevocable consequences, and hard moves do have immediate consequences. So from the book, that's the difference between the two.
Yeah, I think a nice way of looking at it is soft moves. When the GM does something, when the GM reacts in a way, does a thing that can be considered a soft move, it means that the players have a chance to avoid it or escape it, right? And so as a result, 7 to 9 results, for example, particularly on Defy Danger, that's a great place to do a soft move. But like you said earlier, it depends a lot on the context and scope of what's happening, right? It could be that, if you're facing off against a group of powerful monsters and you do Defy Danger to try to escape them or whatever, and you do a 7 to 9, a soft move in that situation might be the monsters like, they're gaining on you. You're going to have to roll again to get away for good or something like that. But a hard move might make more sense if it's a big, powerful group of monsters. It might make more sense to like let the player escape and then do a hard move of you escape, but you take some damage, because taking hit point damage is generally considered a hard move because you can't avoid it. You take the damage and that's it, right? So it really very much depends on the scope of what's going on. But as a general matter, a soft move is something that is like telegraphed, or it's like danger on the horizon, or it's something that you can avoid, right? And it usually has a follow-up roll right after it, or pretty close after it. Hard move is something that is just, you cannot be avoided. You take some kind of penalty, the thing happens. So for example, a 6- result, that's usually a hard move, right? Classic thing is, okay, you take some damage. Or it could be like, your sword breaks or something like that, right? That would be a hard move. It's like you've said a thing, the player cannot avoid it. It just is what it is. But again, it depends on the context and the scope of the situation, right? You might get a 6- result to, maybe you are trying to like sneak through a heavily fortified and guarded palace. And so you do a Defy Danger with dexterity or something like that, right? And you get a 6-. It might make more sense in the fiction, instead of like you getting caught, the GM might deem, you know what? You leave some kind of trace of your presence, and now everybody's on high alert. That's a totally legit 6- result in that fictional circumstance, right? But it's a soft move, right? It's not a hard move, because you have a chance to still avoid the palace's guards and stuff who are more alert now, who are keeping an eye out, but they haven't caught you yet.
I agree. I think that's one of the cool things that Dungeon World does, is that your 6- triggers your GM moves, and some of those moves are not like the character fails at what they're doing right now. Some of the moves encourage you to, as the GM, say how they succeed, but it didn't go it was a bad thing that they succeeded and things like that. So I do appreciate that for some of the moves.
Offer them some kind of opportunity at a cost, right? Something like that, you know? Yeah. So, I mean, what we're really getting at here is I think it's important, listeners, if you're the brand new DWGM, to understand the basics of like what's a soft move and what's a hard move, and practice. I mean, you have to practice it. Practice like when should your move be like, you know, irrevocable, like boom, you take damage, boom, your sword is broken, boom, you got grabbed and you're thrown in a prison cell. When should it be a little softer? Oh, the monster is charging at you and you're stuck in a, you know, you're stuck in a sinkhole, or you see the guards come around the corner and they see you and they send up the cry, you know, like you have to kind of make a judgment call there as a GM, and it's something you get better at as you play. But fundamentally, like just at the outset, understand the distinction. Yeah.
And I mean, you have the freedom to do both. So sometimes it's more about reading the room, but you know, you'll get to know your players and your audience better the more you play.
Absolutely.
And you'll get to know what you're interested in seeing happen.
And remember the conversation part of it too. That's really, really key. You know, you don't have to have the right answer right away, right? It could be that you throw it to the table a little bit and say, oh man, like what should we do here? Like, what do you think should happen? Like, should we hit this character really hard right now? Or should we, you know, get that conversation going around the table? The players will help you get to the result that is challenging and exciting, but fair. So let's go to a question's posed in the text, which is, when does the GM make moves, right? And we've already kind of said it, but it's the three basic things that it notes are when the players look at you waiting for something to happen, or if they give you a golden opportunity, which we'll define in a moment, or if they roll a 6-. Those are the three kind of basic times when you might be making a move as a GM. And I thought we'd just kind of talk about those a little bit. What do you think, David?
Yeah, that sounds good. So the first one, when players look to you to find out what happens, that's usually because they're not immediately in combat, or else they've just said like they're about to try something in combat.
That's one instance, yeah. Where I most often run into it is, this is a pretty common situation in my games. The players they have just defeated something in the dungeon. Okay. Some kind of monster or something, right? And they are kind of just sitting around trying to figure out what to do next, or maybe I have an idea what's around the corner, but it might not be the right moment for that thing to appear, you know, maybe like I'm not quite far enough along in my Grimportance, which we'll talk about next week. You know, it's like a bit of downtime that's it's not like super obvious what should be happening, right? Or maybe they get to a room where you've left a blank, because that's what you're supposed to do. We talked about that before, right? You've left a blank. You don't know what's going to happen in that dungeon chamber. And the players certainly don't know. And so they're looking at you to like, okay, well, what happens? And I think, you know, that's a great opportunity to look at your move list if you're not sure what to do. Those little like weird downtime moments, those like, okay, they got 20 of your blank spaces on the map moments, or you need for something else to happen before they get to the boss or whatever, right? Like those little moments. That's when you can kind of look at the GM moves. And I think one of them is, well, my personal favorite, offer an opportunity with a cost, right? That's my favorite, because it's like it's almost like a little mini mission or a little side thing, right? So normally for me, it's something like, oh, you see the glimmer of, you know, a treasure chest or something like, you know, high up in the cavern roof or whatever, the ceiling, you know, the ceiling area of the cavern. It's suspended there by big, thick spider webs. You know, what do you do? Right. And that's me doing the move, offer an opportunity with a cost. The opportunity is the treasure chest, right? The cost is the big spiders that are probably nearby, right? So that's a pretty common thing. And that's just one of those instances where you can kind of like look at the moves at a little moment when the players are looking at you, waiting for something to happen, and you kind of like just boom, spring it on them.
Now I'm just thinking about, what's a spider doing with a treasure chest? Is it just trying to lure people? Is it a man-eating spider, and this is what it uses to lure?
Who knows? There's no telling. There could be a littler treasure chest and an adventurer with a bigger treasure chest climbed up there trying to get the little one, and the spider caught him too. So, who knows? The wild vicissitudes of GM moves. Who knows what can happen? But ultimately, I think like that sort of admonition to like, okay, if the players are looking at you, waiting for you to do something, that's kind of what it means, right? It's like, it's kind of one of those moments that you haven't really planned for, or that you don't really know precisely what is supposed to be happening right now. There's no like super obvious thing to happen in the fiction. You can kind of look at your moves and kind of see if something makes sense.
I think that's right. And I think the move that you have recommended to do, well, when the players are looking to you and they're just in a new room and they're not quite sure what's going on, putting something out there on the table as a potential thing they could do, I think is the right move.
Yeah. Another one of the moves is tell them the consequences and ask. It's kind of, like you said earlier, some of them kind of overlap, and this is kind of a similar-ish sort of thing, but it could be, you know, they arrive at a clearly rickety rope bridge, right? A very clearly rickety rope bridge and they're maybe sitting there thinking like, you know, they're going to have that player conversation of like, okay, should we try to cross this? Is there any danger? Like they're kind of kibitzing about it. And that's one of those moments where they might be looking toward you as the GM to give them a little bit extra, right? And so that you might use that move. Well, you know, if you try to cross that bridge, there's a chance that the rope breaks, but you'll be okay if you each go by one with none of your gear, right? Do you want to do that? See, that's that move in action.
Yeah.
Explain the consequences and then ask. So that's another one of those kind of like little moments. But yeah, this is a pretty straightforward thing, right? It's just, okay, something has to happen in the dungeon or wherever, right? So the players are waiting on you. Let's talk about golden opportunities.
Yeah, there's lots of golden opportunity potentials, but the most common kinds are when players or the characters do something foolish or unnecessarily risky. So they run straight at the dragon. That's foolish and unnecessarily risky because you probably can't actually trigger a move, but you can't trigger like hack and slash with a dragon because you can't, unless you have something special, you can't pierce its armor or it'll burn you to a crisp before you get close enough. So
and your reach is just not enough, right?
You don't have the reach.
You just can't get to the dragon, right? That's a golden opportunity, right? A golden opportunity is when the players do when the players do something stupid is essentially what it boils down to, or something excessively risky, or despite your explaining the consequences and asking, they do it anyway, right? Or they do the riskier thing, you know, even though they know that it's risky. That's a golden opportunity, right? Jumping into a battle of 30 orcs by yourself, right? That's a golden opportunity. I don't care how good of a warrior you are. 30 orcs will swarm you and you will be dead, right? That's a great opportunity to use a GM move. So that's what golden opportunities are. And I think, yeah, I don't know what else I have to say about it except that it's, you know, it's a thing.
Yeah, I mean, one circumstance that I come across from time to time that I interpret as golden opportunities are when players, through their characters, like, will stop, linger in a dangerous place and, like, argue about something. I sometimes, if they do it for long enough, I'll take it as a golden opportunity and just do a move.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting here is maybe before you even, like, act on the golden opportunity, maybe you telegraph it with a soft move first, right? Mm-hmm. So they're sitting around chatting, talking. So you decide to do the soft move. It's something like announce future badness or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's basically like hint at something bad happening, right? And so while they're in the middle of having the conversation, you do a soft move of, hey, while you're all talking about this, you start to hear wolves howling in the distance, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's my move to the golden opportunity. Like, just because it's a golden opportunity doesn't mean it's a hard move.
Absolutely. Well, I think the golden opportunity also in that particular case might be they choose to ignore the wolves howling.
Yeah, and then if they do that too,
then they've definitely given you the golden opportunity for a harder move, right? For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the golden opportunities. I think golden opportunity is pretty easy to understand. And then finally, just, you know, when they roll a 6-, we've already kind of talked about that a little bit, but that's going to be the most common situation, I think, when you are called upon to make a move. And in that case, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, if the 6- is not defined, the move does not have a 6- definition. You look to your GM moves and think about what makes sense given the context of the fiction, and then do that thing.
Yeah. So I have a question. The rule says, like, on a 6-, you get to make a GM move. So does that mean, like, if there's a 6- defined outcome, you do the 6- defined outcome and you do a move?
I don't think so. That's never how I've played, but I might be wrong. I don't think so, though. I mean, the vast majority of moves don't have a defined 6-, right? So it's kind of a somewhat of a moot point. But no, to my mind, when a 6- is defined in the move, it's because whoever wrote that move has in mind a very, very specific fictional outcome. And by engaging with the move, you're essentially saying, I risk having that happen to me, right? And so as a result, those moves are usually a little tougher, but the players know what's going to happen if they get a miss on it.
Or the opposite. I mean, sometimes I write a move that I just want to be a social move.
Oh, that's a good point too. Yeah, absolutely.
And I want to make sure, like, I want to make sure the players can just do it and not, like, feel like they're risking a really bad thing happening to them.
That's a good point too. Yeah, that's a great point. That's particularly great for, like, location-based moves, like in the village or something, where the stakes may not be so high. That's fantastic. Yeah, no, so in my opinion, I think you just do whatever the 6- says, and then you don't make a separate GM move at that point.
I think I agree. That's why I write the moves the way I write them. But yeah, I think it's an ambiguous point in the text.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Okay, so now we are going to talk about some of the actual GM moves that are listed as GM moves. And I thought we'd start by just maybe reading them all and then going back and talking about some that we think are worth talking about here, David. So do you want to go ahead and just read the list?
Yeah, sure. So the first move is use a monster, danger, or location move, which is actually like a whole laundry list of moves. The next one is reveal an unwelcome truth. Then the next is show signs of an approaching threat. Another move is deal damage. Another move is use up their resources. The next move is turn their move back on them. The next is separate them. And then next is give an opportunity that fits a class abilities. Then show a downside to their class, race, or equipment. Then offer an opportunity with or without cost. Then put someone in a spot. And finally, tell them the requirements or consequences and ask.
Yeah, so let's just take a look at some of these. I've just written a few notes for each of the ones that I think are worth talking about a little bit more. I'll say at the outset that in the text, these are all explained pretty clearly. Listeners, you don't need David and I to explain what each of these are. They are what they sound like, and the text does a pretty good job of explaining what they mean. But having said that, I think it might be worth kind of unpacking a few of them just to kind of catch some of the nuances a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So using a monster, danger, or location move, that is thousands more moves packed into one move, right? You know, you're probably going to have your monster stat block in front of you. And on the monster stat block, and here I'm just using the example of monsters, but this would be the case for like locations or dangers as well. On the monster stat block, you have listed at the very bottom, there are moves, right? It's the same thing with a danger on your fronts. Often on your danger, you have like a list of moves on the danger or like little things that might happen when you engage with that danger. And those little like bullet point lists at the bottom of each monster block, those are just other moves, right? So those are like legit things you can do. They're much more fictionally specific and therefore a little more appropriate to what's going on and maybe a little more interesting and possibly much more dangerous, but they're things that you can do. I say much more dangerous. It depends on the circumstances, but you know, my favorite is the ghoul, right? The ghoul has a move that is like gnaw off a limb or something like that, right? And that's a lot worse than just doing some hit point damage, right? Like losing an arm is considerably worse than like taking hit point damage, but it's another tool in the GM's toolbox.
Yeah. Like it's always something to look at as an option that like lots of these creatures have specific things they can do that are either they change the way the combat will work or like they do something else entirely, like call resources or steal things and things like that.
And I think that like looking at these particular moves, particularly for monsters, I think like understanding this part of the game is a major part of understanding the differences between Dungeon World and say Dungeons and Dragons, right? And here's what I mean. If you're fighting a deep elf mage or whatever, or some kind of like drow, you know, elf where they have magical powers and things like that, in Dungeons and Dragons, you would roll initiative and everybody would take their turn. And on the Drow Elf's turn, you might choose to cast their web spell or something, right? And that's how that would go. But Dungeon World you don't really have those options, right? You don't have lists of spells. You don't have those kinds of things. Instead, we have a move listed for the Deep Elf that is Unleash an Ancient Spell. And essentially what that's saying is you, as the GM, have access to all kinds of dark elf magic that this deep elf can do, right? We're not going to tell you all the nitty gritty of that. It's on you to kind of like come up with the fun details, but it's here, right? If the players get a miss on hack and slash, or if they fail to sneak away or whatever, this is when you get to unleash the dark elf's magic, right? We don't have an initiative order or anything like that to tell us when we should do it. You get to do it when you get to make a move. And now, obviously, unleash an ancient spell is very, very vague, or at the very least, it's not super complete. And it does require to some degree that you have some thoughts about what, deep elf ancient magic might look like. But there are no wrong answers. That's a nice thing, right? I bring that up because I think one of the tricky things about running Dungeon World for the first time is not having these very clear divisions of when somebody gets to go and what they get to do.
It's definitely different. It takes some getting used to, but that's a good reminder of hey, this is how creatures work in Dungeon World. You don't wait for the creature's turn. You can use that whenever you have the opportunity to make a GM move.
And incorporate it into your prep, right? I mean, if I know that they're going to run into deep elves that can cast ancient magic, before the session, I might think about what that is, right? What does that ancient magic look like? Is it strange spider summoning rituals? Is it weird, web spells that are electrified or something crazy like that? What does it look like? What is it? You might think about some of those things. So in that sense, the GM moves, in a lot of ways, the GM moves are like a flag post or like a goal post for how you should prep. What does it mean if I have to separate them? That's a standard GM move, separate them. What does it mean if I have to separate them? What does it mean in the dungeon to separate them? Does that mean there might be a trap that causes them to be separated from one another? Is there a magical portal spell or something like that? So GM moves in that way can be kind of a way of prepping. And I think particularly for monster moves and danger moves, it's a great way of kind of organizing your thinking about getting your session ready.
Yeah. For monsters, dangers, and locations. Yeah. You want to think about what could those things do when you get the opportunity to make a move?
What do they look like in the fiction precisely? And once you get the hang of it, it's really fun. And not just that, once you get the hang of it, it's super dynamic, right? The Dungeon World GM move way of doing things creates very cinematic, very dynamic style of play. And I love it. I would never go back to initiative and turn order and all that business. So.
I never want to have to roll for initiative again, please.
So, okay, so that was a lot, but, but I think it was good. Some of these other ones, you had some notes about reveal and unwelcome truth, right?
Yeah, I wanted to try and give a few examples on these moves of what might be soft moves versus hard moves. But reveal and unwelcome truth, just like the book says, is just what it sounds like. Whatever's going on around your characters, there are truths that you, as the GM, know, either from your prep or because you are finding out in the fiction right now. But there is a truth that you will reveal to the players that is unwelcome to the characters. So I wrote a couple examples. One is a soft, one is a hard, and they're off of the same kind of basic setup. So the room is trapped with dangerous obstacles, and somebody has just given you the opportunity to make a GM move. So you say to your players, you hear a click, and blades begin swinging out from slots in the walls in front of you. If you want it to be a soft move, you would say, this will make crossing the room much more dangerous. What do you do? If you want it to be a hard move, you'd say you hear the click and blades begin swinging out from the slots in the wall, and the nearest one catches you. And you would hit them with damage, a debility, or a fictional harm, like it takes some fingers off, or a hand, or a foot, depending on where it hits. And then they still have to figure out how to cross the room.
Those are fantastic examples. I love it. The next one shows signs of an approaching threat, kind of the same thing, right? I would also like to point out that reveal an unwelcome truth and show signs of an approaching threat, they are kind of samey, but you can I usually kind of divide them up in my brain a little bit like this. Reveal an unwelcome truth, I sometimes take that to mean something in the meta plot or something in this sort of bigger story, right? That could be an unwelcome truth as well. You can interpret it however you wish, basically, but just a little nuance there. But show signs of an approaching threat, kind of a similar thing. And the way I think your note about the soft version versus the hard version is really good there and applicable.
They're two very similar things where you can see some nuance, and it gives you some more flexibility as to what your GM move might be.
So dealing damage, again, pretty straightforward, but you have a question here.
Well, yeah, I just don't know if this can ever be a soft move. I don't know what that would even mean.
I don't think it can.
I guess, like, if the consequence could be much worse, you could make one of these other moves, and it would also deal damage, and you choose to just deal damage through some other means, then like that might be situationally softer, but it's still immediate consequences, so I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think dealing damage can ever be a soft move. Even if you only deal 2 hit points of damage or 1 hit point of damage, it still can't be avoided. The thing is done, right? They have taken the hit point damage. So it may not be a lot of hit points. It's still a hard move.
Yeah.
Use up their resources. You have the same question here. Like, can this ever be a soft move?
Can this ever be a soft move? Maybe if you let the players choose what they're losing, that makes it softer, but it's still an immediate consequence.
Probably depends on the resource. If it was a magic item that could be used X number of times before it has to be recharged, maybe you cause a power or magic surge or whatever that causes all the charges to discharge, and they can still get the charges back, but they can't use it right now. That's a softer version than, say, the magic item explodes.
Right.
But it's still using up their resources. So yeah, ultimately, I don't think it really matters much, but but it's worth thinking about for sure. Turning their move back on them. This is a great move and probably deserves to be talked about a little bit because it can be a little tricky. It's an interesting move. So what are your initial thoughts here on turn their move back on them?
After like rereading the text in the book about turning the moves back on the players or the characters, it seemed to come down to like one thing. The move works, but that's a bad thing. And why it's a bad thing, that's what you need to decide as the GM. There's lots of ways that could go.
You mean the player move goes off, but it was a problem for something.
Right.
Like they succeed, but there's a cost, essentially.
Well, not even they succeed, but there's a cost. Like, they succeed, but that's a bad thing for them. They pick the lock, open the door, and standing on the other side waiting for them is something real bad or something like that.
Yeah. Obviously this conversation depends a lot on the context of whichever player move is being used, right? But in terms of like cognitive load for the GM, it can be really interesting to think about player moves in this way. And because you can kind of like, sometimes the hard thing as a GM in Dungeon World is thinking like, well, what should I do right now? Like, okay, what should be the result? What should be the consequence? What should happen? And an easy thing to do is to grab onto whatever they were trying to do and then turn it back on them, right? And again, it depends on kind of what they were trying to do. But for example, if they are, trying to fire a bunch of arrows off, to like hit some monsters and they roll a 6- or a 7-9 or something like that, I might say that, well, you're definitely going to get your volley off or whatever, or on a 6-, okay, maybe you get your volley off. You're still going to hit some stuff. It's going to be great. But in your haste of getting it done, you snap your bowstring or something like that, right? Or you get sloppy and you use too many arrows, all your arrows are gone or something like that, right? That's one way of kind of turning their move back on them, kind of. It could be something like the one that players hate is I'm a druid and I'm changing into a bear or a monkey or something, and they get a miss. And so you turn their move back on them by saying, well, now you're a monkey for a long time, right? Like you're going to be a monkey for the rest of the adventure or rest of the session or something, right? I mean, that's a way of doing it. That's a little punitive, but that's another way you could do it. But what I like about just like thinking in those terms is it does give you something to kind of grab onto as a GM, and you can kind of get your brain like kind of flowing and start thinking about like, well, what could go wrong with this move they're doing? Let's talk about separating them is pretty straightforward. I mean, there's lots of different ways you can do it. A trap causes them to fall into another room. They get teleported away. Local soldiers or guards grab them and arrest them, something like that. Let's talk about give an opportunity that fits a class's abilities. I love this move, and it's an interesting GM move because it's not necessarily punitive, right?
Yeah, some of these moves don't have to be, and that's one of these last few in particular are not super punitive necessarily. This is a harder one because like this is more of like a GM mastery kind of thing. Like if you are good at using your moves to look around the table, think about who needs some spotlight and what their character is and what moves they would be interested in triggering off of their move sheet. If you can do that and make that happen dynamically, you'll look like a rock star. That's why this move is here. It's to give you the ability, the opportunity to be creative in that way.
Well, and again, it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about like how the GM moves can goal push your prep a little. You know, if I'm looking at that move, what does it again? Show them something that uses their class's abilities.
Give an opportunity that fits a class ability.
Yeah, give an opportunity that fits a class ability. That is a terrific opportunity. First of all, that adheres to one of our principles, I think, of, you know, being a fan of the player characters, right? Make them look like rock stars, make them look like awesome action adventurers, right? That's a perfect fit for that. That's just a little side note. But what I like about this move is like in prep, like while you're thinking about your session before you sit down to play, you can start thinking about like, well, you know, last session, the bard was bemoaning the fact that they didn't get to use their power that lets them lull people to sleep or whatever, right? And so maybe you start thinking about like, okay, you know, what could happen in the fiction right now where the bard player might get to fire that move off, right? And you know, and it's the GM move that kind of like would, for me at least, that's what I would be inspired by the GM move to do something like that, right? I'd look at that and I'd say, the druid really, really wants to change into a mouse and do mouse reconnaissance or whatever, right? So let's have an opportunity for them to do that. And so now suddenly in the dungeon, you know, there's a little hole or something they can crawl into to go look around, that kind of thing, right? So I like the idea of this move as like a sort of goal posting your prep, right? On the fly, it's a little tougher, like David said. That's a terrific GMing skill.
This is another one to maybe think about when your players are just in a new area trying to think of what to do and not quite sure, and then they look to you and what could they do. And like Jason's example is perfect. Like if you have a druid, you just would say to them, you know, oh, look there's a crevice that's really small, but you could fit in there if you were a small creature.
Or, hey, look, there's a treasure chest stuck up in those cobwebs. You could change it to a monkey and go grab it. I don't know, whatever. The next one is show a downside to their class, race, or equipment. This is the same thing, just in the opposite direction, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's more extensive. Now it's not just their class and class abilities, but it's everything, you know? Everything's on the table. If they're a spear wielder, now there's a tight corridor, or else all the enemy presses in too close to make good use of that spear. Things like that. I mean, I'm always good for some halfling mishaps. So
yeah, it's the sconce is too high on the wall. Sorry, halfling. Right? Yeah, that's a classic. Like that's a classic one for the races. Yeah, using the size of the creatures, that kind of thing. It's a pretty straightforward one though. It's fun to play with, and again, it's another one like you can kind of look at from like the perspective of like before the session starts, right? Starting to think about ways you can make the thing that they love about their character, way you can kind of make it a hindrance or something, a challenge they have to overcome. Offer an opportunity with or without cost. We already talked about that quite a bit, but do you have a note here, nevertheless?
Well, yeah, I was not sure if this could ever be a hard move because it seems as though you can never have immediate consequences. So maybe this is just one to think about when you're thinking about your soft moves.
Yeah, good point. Put someone in a spot.
So this is a little bit like some of the other moves that we've talked about before. But like we said, like there's overlap on these. And I thought maybe an example of a good like soft one and a good hard one might be helpful here. But basically, when you're putting someone in a spot, there's something going on that fictionally positions them to have a hard time. And you can still do a soft move with this, I think. Like, say, for instance, someone gets a 6- on a hack and slash. You could say your blade gets stuck in a log as you swing and miss. You probably can't pull it out before the enemy turns their blade on you. What do? Or the hard move on that would be your blade gets stuck in the log, you swing and miss. Just as you pull it free, you feel the slight pressure of a blade at your throat, and you hear the heavy breathing of your opponent directly in your ear, as if they've just come up behind you.
Yeah, it's pretty good. I like that. Again, I love this. I love the way you've done your notes, David, of like thinking about these moves in terms of soft and hard, because it's so important for running Dungeon World, right?
Yeah, it's a good thing just to think about, like, you know, maybe even after you've had a session, like, think about, like, when did I do soft moves? When did I do hard moves? What would it even mean to be a hard move? And that'll just get you faster. The repetition will get you faster. And that's just how you can get to be better at your GMing skills.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last one is tell them the requirements or the consequences and ask. We've already talked about that a bit. But again, classic Dungeon World thing. And it's a perfect move for when the players are looking at you, waiting for you to do something. So I think that pretty much covers it on the GM move discussion. I want to just wrap up really quickly by saying, listeners, that this is for brand new DW GMs. It's not actually that hard. Like, I'll go back to my original advice of just think about the scope of what's going on in the fiction. Think about what makes sense, what's honest, and irrespective of what the moves list says, just do that thing, right? Because it probably fits one of the GM moves anyway. The GM moves are a terrific way of sort of framing your thinking about how to run the game and thinking about like what kinds of things can happen. And especially for your prep, it's a great way of like signaling to yourself, like, okay, I should have some things that do this, or I should prep a few things that might do this, or I should start thinking about this. But otherwise, you can't go wrong as a GM by just paying really close attention to the fiction and just being honest, right? And if all else fails, talk it out with the table.
I think you're right. Like, exploiting your prep is a big part of executing these moves nicely. And if you find yourself constantly like going to like deal damage, maybe you come back and look at the moves again and realize you have more options.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's easy to fall into that just do damage rut, right? And you're right. That's a great note, actually. That's a great sign of like, okay, I need to refresh myself on the GM moves. Let's go to the AP. Hi, listeners. I wanted to let you know that the newest issue of Codex, Joy 2, is now available in the Gauntlet's $4 Patreon feed. It's a sequel to the original Codex Joy, and it's terrific. Here is what you'll find inside. Storm Riders, a rules-like game inspired by the action-packed fantasy cartoons of the 1980s, such as Masters of the Universe and Thundercats. A Feast of Jovial Moments, a collection of evocative images for Swords Without Master and other swords and sorcery games. Grandma's Drinking Song, a hilarious songwriting LARP that tells the story of a family of Jewish bootleggers in 1930s New York City. True Beauty, a framework that recontextualizes the game Monster Hearts 2 to be about young queer people of color in the ballroom scene of 1980s Harlem. Our miscellany, 36 local holidays and celebrations, 5 original illustrations, and a gorgeous custom layout by Jake Householder. You can get Codex Joy 2 by making a $4 or higher pledge on the Gauntlet Patreon by November 30th. As a bonus, you will also receive the original Codex Joy. And a quick reminder that back issues of Codex can be found on DriveThruRPG. Thanks. Okay, this is our ongoing actual play featuring the adventures of Lucero Castafiel. And when we last saw Lucero, he was rescuing his sister, Urbina, from, well, she was attached to a wall with all kinds of strange vein-like tubes coming out of her body. She's turned into a vampire at this point, and he was getting ready to cut her free. But as soon as he cut one of these veins that are kind of securing her to the wall, a moan rose up from all of these bodies that are interred in this subterranean space. And I'll remind you, there are hundreds and hundreds of them. And so, Lucero, you make that cut, and you hear that loud moaning. I described it last time as a cacophony of doom. And my question is, what do you do?
I think I freeze and probably feel a shiver run up my spine, and I turn around and looking for movement or looking for anything that might be evidence of a change from last I was looking that way.
I mean, I'll just say, I don't need a roll here. I'll just tell you that you start to see a couple of them tumbling out of their slots. Just to refresh your memory, they're stacked kind of high in these large, like, blocks, where they're kind of like laying flat horizontally. And you see a couple of them like rolling out and crashing down to the ground. And a few more are starting to shift, move their arms and move their legs. It's like they're not exactly all on the move, but they're definitely getting that way. What do you do?
They're coming active. Does it seem like I could cut her free in just a few seconds, or would this take minutes?
Here's where I might give you Discern Realities, just because, I don't think you have like a long time to sort of study the situation, but I think you have enough time to make a judgment call, an informed judgment call. And so give me a DR.
Okay. 8.
You get one question from the list.
Is what is about to happen?
If you continue to cut these veins, these cords, more of them will animate. If you free her completely, the whole place comes alive. Now you get a +1 forward when following up on that. So what do you do?
So, I mean, I've got to cut her free. Unless it's like cutting through ropes and it's going to take minutes, I've got to cut her free.
And she's kind of like going in and out of lucidity, right? And the last thing she said to you was, "I'm fine," right? But she's kind of like passed out at this point. So what do you do?
Yeah, I think I'm just making as quick a work of this as I can, cutting with both hands on the two halves of my weapon, just slicing at all of these, working from like top to bottom so that she ends up kind of slumped over me, and I can hopefully try and make a break for it.
Let's do Defy Danger with Dexterity, and you get a +1 as well.
Okay. 11.
Nice. I'm going to give you control of the fiction here. You're going to be able to free her and maybe not escape completely, but you'll at least be able to get back to that ladder, assuming you're going back to that ladder.
Okay.
But they're going to be on your heels, though, nevertheless. So, but just describe that, like, as they're coming alive, as you're, grabbing her. Like, what does all this look like?
Yeah, so I think I take the two halves of the weapon, one in each hand, and I slice kind of around her from top to bottom, as if I'm drawing a snow angel on the wall. And as I'm getting like lower towards her feet and legs, like she slumps, her upper half of her body slumps over my shoulder, and I clip the last few by her feet and legs, and then like jump down and with her on my shoulder and just am running as fast as I can pell-mell towards that ladder as I hear the groans and probably more screams of these things, and hearing their popping joints from disuse as they stand up and start to clamber after me.
Well, I think the classic cinematic moment would be the camera kind of swoops up and we see you with her slumped over your shoulder, like running down these, like, I described them before as like a grid, right, of these like interments, and you're kind of running down and we just see these zombies or whatever they are kind of like falling, like tumbling out of their little like slots, right? Like, and they just begin to like kind of mass on top of one another and press forward, like after the two of you. You get to the base of the ladder and you just see these hundreds of creatures like just getting ready to swarm. And I think we'll pick it up next time.
Sounds good.
Listeners, that's our show. We hope you enjoyed it. Discern Realities is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find us on Twitter at Gauntlet RPG. We still have a G+, even though G+ is going away. Our G+ community, just go there to the community section and search for The Gauntlet. You will find us there. We have a website. That's gauntlet-rpg.com. And we are on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. David, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason.
And thanks, listeners. Take care.